What happens when the most feared man in New Orleans falls apart at home, and the only person who can hold his world together is the broke, heavy-set woman everyone else overlooked? She wasn't there to save anyone. She just needed to keep the lights on. Augustin Dragici had built his empire the way most men build walls. One brutal decision at a time, stacked high enough that nobody could see what was crumbling on the other side. As the undisputed head of the Crescent Coast Syndicate, he controlled the Port Authority, 3 city councilmen, and enough judges to fill a courthouse. He wore hand-stitched charcoal suits and moved through rooms the way weather moves. You didn't notice it coming until it had already changed everything around you. His name was spoken in hushed tones from the Garden District to the 9th Ward. Even men who had never met him were afraid of him. But the thing nobody talked about was the 8-year-old girl upstairs who hadn't spoken a word in 14 months. Her name was Sophie. She was small and dark-eyed and had her father's stubborn jaw, and after the accident that took her mother on a flooded stretch of I-10 one November morning, she had simply gone quiet. The doctors called it selective mutism, brought on by acute grief. The parade of specialists Augustin had hired called it a complex trauma response. The 7 caregivers who had cycled through the Dreggy estate in the past year called it privately terrifying and quit anyway. The last one, a highly credentialed woman from a prestigious agency uptown, had lasted 9 days before she handed back her key card and walked out without collecting her final check. Sophie had locked herself in the bathroom for 6 hours, silent and immovable as stone. Because the woman had moved one of the drawings Sophie kept pinned to the wall beside her bed. A drawing of her mother. The woman hadn't known. It didn't matter. Sophie had screamed without making a single sound, which was somehow worse than screaming, and by the time Augustin's head of security, a quiet man everyone called Reef, had coaxed the door open, the caregiver was already calling a car. Augustin sat in his study that evening staring at a glass of Armagnac he hadn't touched and told Reef to find him someone different. Not someone impressive, someone real. 40 miles away, in a cramped apartment above a dry cleaning shop on Magazine Street, Winifred Oats was doing the math again and coming up short. Everyone called her Freddie. She was 26 years old, 5'3", and carried herself in the particular way of women who had learned early that the world was not built to accommodate them, with a kind of quiet, deliberate steadiness, like she was always bracing for something, but didn't want anyone to know it. She had her grandmother's brown eyes and her mother's tendency to hum without realizing it, and roughly 280 pounds distributed across a frame that strangers felt entitled to comment on, which she had long since stopped letting herself hear. She worked the breakfast and lunch shift at a diner on Magazine Street, had a second job doing data entry for a property management company 3 evenings a week, and sent $200 a month to her younger brother, Cade, who was finishing community college in Baton Rouge. What was left after rent and utilities, and the minimum payment on the medical debt from her mother's surgery 2 years ago, was not enough to be called savings. It was enough to be called staying. She had applied to the domestic placement agency on a Tuesday because the diner's owner had pulled her aside and told her that things were slow and he was going to have to cut her shifts. He said it apologetically. It didn't make it better. By Thursday, she had filled out the paperwork, submitted her references, and was sitting in a small waiting room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee while a woman named Mrs. Fontenot looked at her resume over the tops of her reading glasses with an expression that was doing its best to stay neutral. The job, Mrs. Fontenot explained, was residential. Live-in. The family was private. The child was. She paused here in the careful way of someone choosing their words for legal reasons. Going through a difficult period, several previous caregivers had found the placement not to be a good fit. Freddie looked at the number on the paper Mrs. Fontenot slid across the desk. She kept her face still. It was the same face she used at the diner when a table was rude, or when someone made a comment about her size disguised as concern. Measured, present. Not giving anything away. "What kind of difficult?" she asked. Mrs. Fontenot said, "She doesn't talk, hasn't in over a year. She's not violent. She's just—" Mrs. Fontenot paused again. "She's grieving, and she makes that very clear without saying a word." Freddie thought about her mother's hospital room, about sitting for 4 days in a chair beside a bed, not knowing what to say, and finally just reaching over and holding her mother's hand and humming the song her grandmother used to sing over the stove on Sunday mornings, low and slow like warm water, about how her mother had relaxed on the 3rd day in a way she hadn't since the diagnosis, just from that. "I understand grief," Freddie said. "I'll take it." The Draghici estate sat behind iron gates off a quiet street in Old Metairie. Not showy from the outside, which was the point. The house was large and old and beautiful in the way of things that have been maintained so rigorously they never show their age. When Freddie arrived in an Uber she couldn't fully afford, carrying a duffel bag and a canvas tote with her good cast-iron skillet inside, because she never went anywhere without it, the gate guard looked at her for a long moment before he spoke into his radio. Reef met her at the front door. He was a wide, calm man with a shaved head, and eyes that were taking inventory of everything without appearing to. He looked at her duffel bag. He looked at the cast-iron skillet. "The skillet comes with me," Freddie said before he could ask. He almost smiled. "Come on in." The house was immaculate and cold in the way of places where nobody was comfortable enough to leave things lying around. Freddie noticed the absence of the ordinary. No shoes by the door, no cups left on the counter, no jackets draped over chairs. Everything in its place, everything controlled. It felt less like a home than like a photograph of one. Reef led her to a formal sitting room and told her Mr. Draghici would be with her shortly. She sat on the edge of a chair upholstered in dove-grey silk and told herself to breathe. When Augustin Draghici walked into the room, Freddie understood immediately why people were afraid of him. It wasn't his size, though he was tall and built, with the kind of density that suggested he had spent years in rooms where the cost of weakness was higher than she could calculate. It was the stillness he moved and spoke, and looked at things the way a man moves who has never once been surprised, as though every possible outcome had already been accounted for, and he was simply watching events catch up to what he already knew. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. She looked back. He said, "You're the placement from Fontenot's agency." She said, "Winifred Oats. Freddie." He said, "You were told about Sophie's situation." She said, "I was." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved over her in assessment, not the kind that was cruel, but the kind that was professional, which she had learned to tell apart. He was weighing something. The previous caregivers were all certified specialists, he said. They had credentials. Training in childhood trauma. They lasted an average of 11 days. Freddie said, "What did they all do that was the same?" He paused. "What?" she said. "If 7 people with the same kind of training all failed the same way, there's probably something they all did the same. What was it?" St. Augustin Draghici looked at her for a moment that stretched. "They tried to engage her," he said finally. "Techniques, strategies. They were always trying to fix her." Freddie nodded slowly. "She isn't broken," she said. "She's just quiet." Something to have named it exactly. It was the way a fire changes when you stop fighting it and just let it breathe. Augustin said, "The pay is as discussed. You'll have your own room and full access to the kitchen. Reef will walk you through the security protocols." He turned, then stopped. "She's in the garden," he said. "She goes there most afternoons. You can introduce yourself. Don't push." He left without waiting for her to answer, which she was already learning was simply how he moved through the world. Freddie found Sophie in the back garden, sitting cross-legged on the flagstone beside a raised bed of herbs. methodically pulling the dead leaves off a rosemary bush and making a small pile of them beside her knee. She was small for 8, with her father's dark coloring and a seriousness in her face that did not look like sadness so much as concentration, as though she were applying her full attention to the problem of being alive and had not yet reached a satisfying conclusion. Freddie sat down on the flagstone, about 4 speaking, and without asking permission. She looked at the pile of dead leaves. She looked at the pile of dead leaves. After a while, she pulled her own small pile together from the leaves that had blown against the edge of the raised bed. They sat like that for 20 minutes. Sophie did not look at her, but she also did not leave. The first week was the same. Freddie moved through the house at a careful distance, never hovering, never performing warmth she hadn't earned. She brought Sophie breakfast on a tray and left it without comment. She sat in the garden when Sophie was in the garden. In the evenings she cooked real food, the kind that took time, because she had always believed that the smell of something made with patience was its own kind of language, and the house had been fed on takeout and catered trays for long enough that even the kitchen seemed to exhale with relief. The smell of her grandmother's butter biscuits traveled up the stairs on the 3rd morning. Freddie was in the kitchen when she heard the soft scuff of small feet on the landing. She didn't look up. She kept rolling. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair unbraided, watching. Freddie said without turning, "I've got about 3 minutes before these need to go in. If you want to help, press the tops down. You're welcome to wash your hands and come over." A long pause, then the sound of the step stool being dragged to the sink. Augustine, coming down for coffee, stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stood very still. Sophie was standing at the marble island next to Freddie Oats, pressing her small thumb into the top of a biscuit round. Freddie was humming something low and formless. Sophie's face was not exactly smiling, but it was open in a way Augustine had not seen in 14 months, the same way a room looks when someone finally lifts a shade and lets the light come in from the side. He stood in the doorway for a while without speaking. Eventually, Freddie glanced over her shoulder and said, "Biscuits are in 12 minutes. Coffee's already made." His name came a half-second later, Mr. Dragici. He poured his coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, which no one had used for eating since his wife died, and he stayed until the biscuits came out. He told himself it was because he had an early call to take from the table. He did not examine that too closely. In the weeks that followed, the estate began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Sophie started leaving her room with less resistance. She began sitting at the kitchen island while Freddie cooked, sometimes drawing in her notebook, sometimes just watching. She had not spoken, but she had started responding, a nod, a small shake of her head, the careful act of sliding a finished drawing across the island toward Freddie, and waiting while Freddie looked at it with the serious attention it deserved. Augustine noticed his own behavior changing and could not entirely account for it. He had always worked evenings in his study, door closed, which was practical and necessary. Now he found himself drifting to the kitchen after Sophie was in bed, ostensibly for a drink, ostensibly because the light was on. Freddie was always doing something when he arrived. Bread cooling on a rack, notes she was taking about Sophie's responses. The crossword from the newspaper, half finished, pushed to the side. He started talking, not about anything important at first. The neighborhood, the biscuit recipe. Whether the rosemary in the garden was worth saving. Freddie listened the way she did everything, without rushing it, without performing interest, just actually present. One evening he told her about the night of the accident, not the clinical facts which he had recited many times in the months after. The other part, the part where he had been sitting at that same kitchen table on the phone when it happened, and how that detail had lodged in him like something structural, a weight-bearing wall he could not move without the whole thing coming down. He hadn't told anyone that. Freddie didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I think about the last normal thing all the time, too." She told him about the morning of her mother's diagnosis, how she had been annoyed that morning, actually irritated, about something small and stupid, a coffee cup left on the wrong counter. How that irritation was the last uncomplicated feeling she'd had for a long time. They sat with that for a while, which was more useful than most of the things either of them had said out loud in the past year. He noticed things about her. The way she moved through a room with a kind of grounded certainty that had nothing to do with how much space she took up, and everything to do with the fact that she had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was allowed to be in it. The way she laughed when something was actually funny, not the polite, careful laugh she sometimes deployed in his presence, but the real one, which was surprised out of her and loud and entirely unguarded. The way she talked to Sophie, never above her, always beside her. He had been surrounded for years by people who performed every feeling for an audience. She didn't perform anything. He was watching her one Sunday evening, when she was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something that smelled of garlic and tomatoes and red wine, humming the same formless tune he had started to recognize, and he understood that he was in a serious amount of trouble. He took his bourbon to his study and sat with it in the dark for a long time. The problem arrived on a Wednesday, which was the kind of ordinary day trouble preferred. Freddie's brother Cade called her in the afternoon while she was in the garden with Sophie. She stepped away to take it, and when she came back, her face was doing the thing it did when she was working hard to stay level. Sophie looked up at her with those dark, assessing eyes that were so much her father's. Freddie sat back down on the flagstone and said quietly, "My brother's in some trouble." "It's okay, I'm going to figure it out." She said it to Sophie. She was also saying it to herself. What had happened was this. Cade, 22 and earnest and not yet wise enough to fully understand who he was borrowing from, had taken a short-term loan from a man named Dix Parlow, who ran a small predatory lending operation in Baton Rouge with connections to a theft ring that Augustine's syndicate had been quietly dismantling for 2 years. Cade needed $800 for a car repair that would let him get to work. He had gone to Parlow because the forms were easy and nobody asked for a credit history. The loan was for $800. The interest terms were structured so that by the time Cade realized what he owed, the number was $4,300 and climbing. When Cade called Freddie, Parlow's people had already come by his apartment once. They had not been polite. Freddie did not tell Augustine. This was deliberate. She was his employee. Cade was her responsibility. She had always managed her own disasters, and she was not going to walk into that study and put her family's problems on a man who was already carrying enough of his own. She would figure it out. She had figured out harder things. She started calculating. She could borrow against her next 2 paychecks. She could call the property management company about picking up additional hours. She could call Cade's landlord herself and explain. She stayed up very late the first night making lists with a pencil on a legal pad, and by the end of it she had a plan that was functional if not comfortable and required everything going right for 3 months in a row. It was Reef who noticed first, which was simply what Reef did. He came to find her on a Thursday morning while she was starting Sophie's breakfast and told her quietly that she had seemed distracted the past few days. He said it without accusation, the way he said most things. She said she was fine. He said, "Mr. Dragici notices things." She said, "I know." He nodded and left, and Freddie stood at the stove for a moment and breathed. Augustine came to find her that evening. He waited until Sophie was in bed and the kitchen was clean and Freddie was sitting at the kitchen table with her legal pad and her pencil and her careful lists. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was simply how he was, and looked at the legal pad. "Tell me," he said. She closed the pad. "It's not your problem," she said. He said, "Winifred, everything in this house is my concern. You are in this house. Tell me." She looked at him for a moment, that careful, measuring look he had come to know, and then she told him. All of it. The loan, the interest, Parlo's people at Cade's door, the numbers on her legal pad, and how close they came to being enough. When she finished, Augustin was very still. It was a different kind of stillness than his usual one, not the professional stillness of a man accounting for outcomes, but the stillness of someone holding something carefully. He said, "Dix Parlo." She said, "You know him." He said, "I know of him." He is a small man making large mistakes. There was something in his voice that she understood at a cellular level was not a good sign for Dix Parlo's immediate future. She almost said something about that. Instead, she said, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I have a plan." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just for a moment, just enough. He said, "Your brother will not be bothered again by morning. The debt is gone. And I need you to let me do this, because you have spent 6 weeks caring for my daughter, and the thought of you sitting here at midnight adding up numbers because someone is threatening your family is—" He stopped. He said, "It is not something I'm able to sit with." She looked at him. There was something in her face she was working to keep composed that she was not entirely succeeding at. She said, "I'm just the caregiver." He said, "No, you're not." The next morning, Parlo's people did not come back to Cade's apartment. Parlo himself received a visit from 2 of Augustin's men that resulted in the permanent dissolution of his lending operation and a strongly worded understanding about what occurred when someone adjacent to the Dragici household was made uncomfortable. Cade called Freddie at 9 in the morning to tell her something had happened, and he didn't fully understand what. But the men had not come back. Freddie sat down on the bottom step of the staircase and held the phone for a while after the call ended. Sophie found her there. The girl sat down on the step beside her without asking why. After a moment, she leaned her small head against Freddie's arm. Freddie put her arm around her. They sat like that until Augustin appeared in the hallway and saw them. His daughter, who had not chosen to be near another person in 14 months, leaning quietly into the side of the woman who had spent 6 weeks simply being present without asking anything in return. He leaned against the doorframe and watched them for a long moment. Then, very quietly, from somewhere beside Freddie's shoulder came a small, rusty sound, like a door being opened that hadn't been used in a very long time. Sophie said, "Freddie," 1 word. The first word in 14 months. Freddie went completely still. She didn't react the way she wanted to react, which was to cry and hold the girl tighter and make noise. Because she understood that would frighten her, she just tightened her arm a little and said, in the same even, warm voice she always used, "Yes, honey." Sophie said, "Are you sad?" Freddie said, "A little. But the good kind." Sophie considered this. Then she nodded like that made sense, which it did, and went back to leaning on her arm. Augustin had to leave the hallway. He turned the corner and stood with his back against the wall for a moment with his eyes closed, doing the careful accounting that men like him had to do when they were surprised by something that had come in under the defenses they had spent years building. His daughter had spoken. Freddie Oats, 26 years old, from Magazine Street, had walked into his house with a cast-iron skillet and a capacity for stillness that turned out to be exactly the shape of what was missing, and his daughter had spoken. He stayed against the wall until he was sure his face was arranged correctly. Then he walked back toward the kitchen to put on coffee. Freddie appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "She spoke." Freddie said, "She did." He said, "To you." She said, "She'll talk to you too, when she's ready. She just needs to know it's safe to try." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that he was not bothering to arrange correctly anymore. He said, "You have done something for this family that every qualified, credentialed, trained professional could not do, and you did it by simply—" He stopped. "By simply being exactly who you are." She looked down at the counter. She had a habit, he'd noticed, of looking away when someone was kind to her, as though she was still deciding whether to trust it. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her and waited until she looked up. He said, "Freddie, look at me." She did. He said, "I have spent many years in rooms where every single person wanted something from me. You have never wanted anything from me except for me to be less alone in my own house. I don't know what that makes you, but it is something I have not encountered before." She said, "I just cooked some food." He said, "You put my daughter back in the world." And then, because he was a man who was deliberate about most things, he lifted his hand and curved it against the side of her face, and he waited, long enough that she could step back if she wanted to. She didn't step back. She breathed out, slowly, like something she'd been holding for a long time had finally been given permission to let go. He kissed her, not gently, not tentatively, but with the full weight of a man who had made up his mind. She kissed him back with the full weight of a woman who had spent years being told in small and large ways that she did not deserve exactly this, and who was, finally standing in a kitchen in Old Metairie that smelled of garlic and rosemary and fresh coffee, deciding not to believe that anymore. In the months that followed, the Dragici estate became something it had not been since before the accident. The kitchen table was used for meals. The coat hooks by the door had coats on them. Sophie's drawings migrated off her bedroom wall and down to the refrigerator, held up with magnets, the way a child's drawings are supposed to be. Sophie herself moved through the house with a growing, tentative confidence, talking first to Freddie, then to Reef, who turned out to be an unexpectedly patient audience, then, one morning over biscuits, to her father. A full, complete sentence, asking him if he would come to the garden with her to see if the rosemary had grown back. He said yes. He went. He stayed out there for an hour, sitting on the flagstone with his daughter, which was the most important meeting he attended that entire week. Augustine's syndicate noticed a change in him that they could not quite categorize. He was still precise, still methodical, still the man who ran the coast with the kind of quiet authority that required no performance. But the edge that had been there since the accident, a particular quality of someone with nothing left to lose, had shifted into something that looked, improbably, like someone with everything to protect. Which was more dangerous, some of them quietly noted. Much more dangerous. Freddie Oats, who had come to that house with a duffel bag and a cast-iron skillet, and 280 pounds of quiet, grounded, unhurried herself, became the still center around which the whole complicated, dangerous, unlikely world of the Dragici household reorganized itself. Not because she had tried to fix anything, but because she had understood, from the very first afternoon in the garden, that some things don't need fixing. They just need someone willing to sit close enough and stay.